Just 14 minutes on a flight, enough time for a black man to be humiliated, 5 passengers to start recording, and one shocking truth to leave first class in stunned silence. His name was Ibrahim Traoré. To them, he was just another man in plain clothes, too quiet, too black, too out of place in a cabin lined with designer suits and champagne flutes. They stared. They whispered. One flight attendant did more than that. She judged, mocked, and tried to erase his dignity, all before takeoff. But when the plane landed, everything changed. A red carpet appeared. Soldiers saluted. The door opened, not for a celebrity, but for the man in seat 2A, the president of Burkina Faso. And in that moment, every sneer, every insult, every assumption came crashing down like silence before thunder. This story, though fictional, speaks a truth that's painfully real. Respect should never depend on appearances. The names and events may be imagined, but the emotions, the injustice, the message, they're as real as every person who's ever been misjudged, silenced, or seen only for the color of their skin. Now, let's take that flight together. It was just another ordinary afternoon at Gate 12 of the Charles de Gaulle International Airport, or so it seemed. The terminal pulsed like a living creature, a restless symphony of dragging suitcases, boarding announcements, muffled conversations, and the sharp hiss of espresso machines. Travelers moved like scattered notes across the marble floor, each carrying a tempo of their own. There were families clinging to each other, business people shouting into Bluetooth headsets, couples lost in hurried kisses before departure. Bright lights reflected off polished tiles, casting flickers like staccato bursts in a concerto of chaos. And then, there was him. He didn't move with the tempo. He moved through it, quietly, deliberately. A man in black, tall, broad-shouldered, but with an almost invisible presence. He wore a plain black caftan, long-sleeved, flowing just above the ankle. His shoes were clean, carefully chosen, yet utterly unremarkable. No brand logos, no jewelry, no visible electronics, not even a watch. He had no rolling suitcase, no laptop bag, just a single, small black duffel slung gently over one shoulder, and a first-class boarding pass clutched between his fingers. Nobody noticed him. At first, he didn't try to blend in. He simply was, still, observant. His eyes scanned slowly from behind thin-framed reading glasses. Not in paranoia, but with purpose. He watched everything. He said nothing. He stood among travelers drenched in designer labels, pulling Louis Vuitton carry-ons, and snapping selfies by the luxury brand boutiques. In contrast, this man, dark-skinned, bare-wristed, anonymous, looked almost out of place in the first-class lounge. Yet there he was, sitting quietly on a sleek leather chair, a glass of still water in front of him, a book unopened on his lap. No phone, no scrolling, no distraction, only patience. Some noticed him. Eventually, a man in a blue suit glanced sideways once. Then again, a woman in heels furrowed her brow. One whispered, "Maybe he's a staff member on break." Another muttered, "Strange. He's in the first-class area?" Still no one spoke to him. There was a mystery to him, the kind that unsettles not by presence, but by contrast. In a room full of noise, he was silence. In a space full of show, he was stillness. But there was something else, something beneath the surface, like a calm sea that hides unimaginable depth. He didn't just sit, he occupied space with quiet authority, like a man who had spent his life walking into rooms that didn't want him there, and had long stopped needing permission to exist. Somewhere above, a boarding announcement crackled over the loudspeakers. Flight 227 to Ouagadougou is now boarding. First-class passengers, please proceed to Gate 4. The man rose slowly, no rush, no nerves. He picked up his duffel, adjusted the collar of his caftan with a single, fluid motion, and began to walk toward his gate. But something subtle shifted as he moved. Eyes followed. Conversations paused. A woman lowered her sunglasses. A man raised an eyebrow. He passed a group of passengers waiting in business class. One of them leaned to another and murmured, "He's first class?" Their tone wasn't curious, it was coded, judging. He approached gate 4, where a slim flight attendant with bright red lipstick and a polished gold name tag stood, smiling broadly at a white man in a tailored suit. She scanned his ticket and beamed, "Welcome aboard, sir." But as the man in black stepped forward, the smile vanished. The man in black walked with the quiet confidence of someone who did not need to prove anything. Yet everything about him seemed to offend the unspoken codes of the first-class lounge. He returned to his seat, placed his bag neatly by his feet, and resumed waiting. No phone, no idle chatter. Just watching, breathing, being. And yet that was enough to make people uncomfortable. A couple across the aisle exchanged glances. The man leaned toward his partner and whispered under his breath, "Not quite low enough?" "He doesn't look like first class." A young woman in business attire stole a glance, then quickly turned away, frowning as if something didn't sit right. Perhaps it was the simplicity of his clothing, or his stillness, or his silence. Perhaps it was the way he seemed unbothered by the opulence surrounding him. But it was clear, he didn't fit the profile. At least not the one they had built in their minds. The lounge was a curated world. Leather seats, soft jazz, waiters offering wine. Most passengers held laptops, tablets, luxury briefcases. Everyone seemed busy with something that said, "I belong here." Except for him. He didn't try to belong. He just was. And that in itself was unsettling. Across the lounge, a screen blinked. A boarding call rang out. "Flight 227 to Ouagadougou is now boarding. First-class passengers may proceed to gate 4. A small wave of motion swept the room. People gathered their coats, closed laptops, slung their expensive bags over their shoulders. Among them, the man in black stood slowly, adjusted the strap on his duffel bag, and began walking. Unhurried, composed, calm. At gate 4, a slim blonde flight attendant stood at the entrance. Her makeup was immaculate, her smile precise and trained. The golden tag pinned to her chest read Clara. She welcomed a middle-aged white man with a rich Italian accent. He handed her a glossy boarding pass. Clara beamed. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Delacour. Please enjoy your flight." The man thanked her, adjusted his suit, and walked down the jet bridge. Behind him, the man in black stepped forward. Clara's eyes flicked toward him. Her smile faltered. A barely visible twitch in her jaw betrayed something colder beneath the surface. She looked him up and down, slowly, deliberately, then frowned. "Sir? Are you lost?" The man remained still, polite. "No," he replied calmly. "I'm on this flight." Clara tilted her head, her voice still sugar-coated but stiffening. "This line is for first-class passengers only." He offered the boarding pass with quiet patience. She didn't take it immediately. Instead, she stared at it, then at him, as if trying to match something that refused to align in her mind. The name, the seat, the skin, the simplicity. It didn't add up. Finally, she snatched the pass and glanced at it. "Seat 2A, first class. Confirmed." She blinked, then scoffed. A sound barely audible, but full of judgment. "You must have gotten this by mistake. Or maybe someone else booked it for you." The man didn't answer. His eyes were steady, calm, but not submissive. People behind him in line began to take notice. A woman gasped softly. A young man pulled out his phone. Another shifted uncomfortably, sensing something was off, but not yet knowing how far off it would go. Clara forced a smile, now plastic and forced. "Let me just double-check this with the system. These things happen, you know?" But before she could turn, the man spoke, quietly. "There's no mistake. That's my seat." His tone was measured, not defensive, just firm. Clara's eyes narrowed, her voice sharpened. "I think you're confused. Or maybe someone else used your card. First class isn't for everyone." The air thickened. One by one, eyes turned toward the gate. Some passengers fumbled with their phones. Recording buttons were pressed. A beat of silence. Then a voice, a child's, asked aloud, "Why is she talking to him like that?" Clara ignored it. She looked back at the man, no longer with curiosity, but with something dangerously close to contempt. Please step aside. You're holding up the line. But he didn't move. He simply said, I'll take my seat now. Something in his voice was like steel wrapped in velvet, software but unyielding. Clara hesitated, her control slipping, not just over him but over the narrative forming around her. And all the while the man just stood, quiet, resolute, like a storm waiting, not to lash out, but to let others reveal the thunder in themselves. The man didn't flinch, didn't blink. He simply held out the boarding pass again, steady in his hand, the printed name clear and bold. Ibrahim Traoré, Seat 2A. Clara took it with a sharp tug, as if even the act of touching something he held was beneath her. She held the ticket like it might stain her fingers. With a flick of her wrist, she scanned it under the boarding device. A soft, polite beep chimed, followed by a small green light. Valid. First class. For a moment she froze, not because she doubted the result, but because she hated it. Behind her fake smile, something hardened. Her mouth curled slightly, almost amused, but bitter, as if the machine had just betrayed her. She turned toward him, her voice honeyed but laced with venom. Well, it seems your ticket's valid after all. Congratulations. Her eyes scanned him again, up and down, slower this time, as if still trying to find a reason to deny what the scanner had just confirmed. Enjoy your seat, while it lasts. She stepped aside with the kind of stiffness that wasn't really an invitation, but an obligation. Her smile was gone. Her body language screamed resistance, but the rules had spoken, and for now, she had to obey them. The man inclined his head gently, not as a thank you, but as a quiet acknowledgement of her defeat, and stepped past her. He didn't rush, didn't look back. With each step down the jet bridge, he carried something heavier than a duffel bag, something unspoken, unreadable, but palpable. Dignity under pressure. Inside the aircraft, the first-class cabin shimmered with quiet wealth. Cream-colored leather seats, dimmed lighting, the soft scent of sandalwood and citrus. A cocoon of privilege in the sky. Seat 2A was at the front left by the window. He placed his bag carefully in the overhead bin, sat down and buckled his seatbelt with the precision of someone who had done this many times, though no one would believe it just by looking at him. He leaned back and rested his hands gently on his lap. His gaze settled on the window, though it was unclear if he saw the tarmac or memories far beyond it. Meanwhile, Clara stood at the aircraft door watching him, not in confusion anymore, but in contempt. Her jaw tightened, her fingers curled slightly at her sides. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about control slipping from her hands in front of strangers. She turned sharply and disappeared down the aisle. In seat 2A, the man did not move. His breathing was even, calm, but his presence, his refusal to shrink, his decision not to retaliate, radiated something stronger than defiance, unshakable self-possession. Other passengers began boarding. A few glanced his way, their eyes darting between him and Clara's vanishing figure. No one said a word, but in the silence something unspoken passed between them. Not fear, not pity, something else. Curiosity, respect, maybe even guilt. The man closed his eyes for a brief moment, then opened them again. He was not here to fight, but he would not disappear either. And Clara, wherever she went, she knew it. The first-class cabin of Flight 227 was designed to be a sanctuary above the clouds, a floating haven of silence, sophistication, and selective luxury. Cream-toned seats reclined with a whisper, ambient lighting glowed in soft gold, and a delicate scent of cedar and citrus floated in the air like memory. It was a world meant for comfort, for those deemed worthy of it. Passengers settled in with the smooth efficiency of frequent flyers. Jackets were folded, briefcases stowed, tablets powered up. Every movement was elegant, controlled, choreographed like a quiet ballet of the wealthy. The flight attendants moved gracefully between seats, offering welcome smiles, champagne flutes, and hot towels served on small silver trays. Except one smile didn't return. Clara was no longer the perfectly pleasant hostess she had been at the gate. Her movements remained precise, but her energy had shifted. Sharp, cold, mechanical. And the change was subtle, unless you were paying attention. She glided through the aisle, pausing at each seat with a gentle smile and kind words. "Would you care for a drink to start, Mr. Delacour? Here's a warm towel, madam. Let me know if you need anything." Then she reached row 2. Her eyes glanced briefly at 2A and passed over it. No towel, no greeting, no acknowledgement. She turned to 2B, where an older French woman with pearl earrings smiled warmly and said in accented English, "Just green tea for me, please." Clara nodded, her voice honeyed. "Of course, ma'am." Then she turned, and for the first time looked directly at the man in 2A. Her smile was gone. "What would you like to drink?" she asked flatly. The man looked up, his expression as calm and unreadable as ever. "Just water, please." Clara sighed, not loudly but pointedly. "Sparkling or still?" "Still is fine," he replied, voice steady. She returned moments later and dropped the bottle onto his tray table without a napkin, without a word. The plastic clunked against the hard surface and nearly tipped. He caught it with one hand, tightened the cap, and nodded. "Thank you," he said softly. She didn't respond. He took a sip, then placed the bottle beside him. No sigh, no expression. But the silence in that seat was beginning to weigh heavier than any words. Across the aisle, the French woman in 2B looked over, brow furrowed. She'd seen the towel skipped, the missing napkin, the tone in Clara's voice. She leaned toward him, voice lowered. "Excuse me, why is she treating you that way?" The man turned to her, his expression unchanged. "I don't know," he said. "Maybe she does." Back near the galley, Clara exchanged brief glances with another attendant, a younger man in glasses, the same one who had scanned the man's ticket earlier. He raised an eyebrow at her. She gave a thin smile, then turned away without a word. A few seats back, a businessman adjusted his tie and muttered to his wife, "Something's off here." More passengers began to notice, some subtly, others more openly. Phones were still tucked away, but curiosity was rising. And yet the man in 2A remained composed. He unfolded a small leather-bound notebook, turned a page, and began to write, short, patient strokes of pen on paper. Occasionally he would glance out the window, as if the sky offered him something steadier than the people around him. A storm was forming, not outside the plane, but inside. And it wasn't thunder or turbulence. It was tension. The kind that comes when dignity is tested quietly, methodically, and cruelly. In a place built to mask it all in golden gloss. But the man in 2A didn't fight the storm. He let it build. He sat with it. And the cabin, for all its silence, could feel the pressure rising. The cabin was quiet, but not peaceful. It was the kind of silence where every breath felt measured, every glance carried weight, and every whispered word threatened to shatter the illusion of calm. Passengers had begun to notice. The woman in 2B kept shifting in her seat, eyes darting between Clara and the man beside her. 2 rows back, a man in his 40s tapped the side of his phone, pretending to check notifications while subtly recording. A flight attendant passed through the aisle offering drinks, but her eyes too lingered just a little longer on seat 2A. And across the aisle in 2C sat François Delacour. French, immaculately dressed in a charcoal gray suit with a blue pocket square. CEO of a major logistics firm. He was used to flying first class, used to a world that catered to him, but he was also used to reading people. It was his job to measure risk, to sense tension before it erupted, and right now he was watching Clara. At first he wasn't sure, but after the skipped towel, the flat voice, and now the almost mechanical way she handed out drinks, warmth for everyone, but an icy silence toward one man. The pattern became too obvious to ignore. He studied the man in 2A, still, calm, silent. The man held a slim notebook in his lap, pen moving slowly across the page in tight, neat strokes. His breathing was steady. There was no fidgeting, no sign of discomfort, no effort to defend or justify himself. Just presence, focused, deliberate. Francois couldn't help but admire that. Most men would have spoken up by now, complained, demanded respect. But this man seemed to exist above the insult, like he had seen it all before, and learned long ago that not every battle needs to be fought with noise. Meanwhile, near the galley at the front of the cabin, Clara was no longer hiding her frustration. She leaned against the wall, arms crossed, speaking in hushed tones to the young male attendant, the same one who had earlier scanned the mysterious man's ticket at the gate. He was new, maybe in his 20s, with kind eyes and nervous energy. "You saw him, right?" Clara whispered. "The way he walks in like he owns the place?" The young attendant glanced back down the aisle. "He hasn't said anything rude." "That's the point," she snapped. "People like him always play that silent card, acting humble, waiting for sympathy. It's manipulation." The young man frowned. "Clara, come on." But she leaned closer, her voice dropping lower, colder. "He doesn't belong here. You can feel it. I don't care what his ticket says. First class isn't for people like him." The attendant stiffened. For a moment he said nothing. Then quietly but firmly, "You're crossing a line." Clara scoffed, rolled her eyes. "Number." He crossed it when he thought this cabin was his. "And if nobody else says it, I will. Enough with this pretend equality. Some of us earned our place here." The young attendant didn't reply. He just turned and walked away, his steps quick, his face pale. Back in the cabin, the atmosphere had shifted. More eyes followed Clara now. There were no raised voices, no direct confrontations. But the tension was thick, like the moment before a storm breaks. People weren't just noticing. They were choosing sides quietly, without a word. In seat 2A, the man closed his notebook gently, slipped the pen back into its loop, then folded his hands, resting them on his lap. He stared straight ahead. He knew. He had felt this before, in other rooms, other countries, other uniforms. Prejudice never changed its voice, only its clothing. Sometimes it wore a suit, sometimes a smile, sometimes a flight attendant's uniform with a golden name tag and carefully painted lips. But he would not let it define this moment. Let them whisper. Let them stare. He would remain still, not because he was weak, but because he was stronger than the need to respond. And that silence was starting to make noise. The plane was 30 minutes into its ascent when the first shudder rolled through the fuselage. It wasn't violent, just enough to rattle the ice in untouched glasses and cause heads to turn toward the overhead bins. A soft chime rang from above, and the captain's voice filtered calmly through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're entering a patch of light turbulence. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." Seatbelt signs blinked to life. Passengers murmured quietly. A few chuckled nervously. Others glanced out the windows as if trying to gauge the weather with their eyes. But inside the first-class cabin, the real turbulence wasn't in the air. It sat in the aisle. It simmered between eyes and unspoken judgments. It moved quietly behind a name tag that read Clara. She moved through the cabin, checking belts, her motions brisk, a little too sharp. There was no warmth left in her, just precision, tight, clipped, and cold. When she reached row 2, she leaned towards seat 2B with professional polish. "You're all set, ma'am," she said sweetly, giving the older French woman a reassuring nod. Then she turned to 2A. Her posture straightened just a bit too much. Her smile didn't return. Her voice this time carried a quiet sting. "Better buckle up, sir," she said, the words laced with mockery. "Wouldn't want you flying out of your seat." The implication was subtle, but pointed, like everything else she had done. The man looked up, meeting her eyes. There was no anger, no visible frustration, only that same calm, steady presence. The kind that didn't challenge with volume, but with the weight of stillness. And then he smiled, just a small, polite curve of the lips, almost invisible. Then he said gently, "Thank you for the reminder." Clara froze, not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't say. He hadn't bitten, hadn't flinched, hadn't fed her the reaction she was hoping for, or dreading. Instead, he had disarmed her in the most unexpected way, by maintaining dignity. And somehow, that unsettled her more than if he'd yelled. She straightened, mumbled something inaudible, and moved down the aisle. The turbulence outside continued, subtle but persistent, the plane bobbing ever so slightly, as if echoing the discomfort in the cabin. The lights flickered for a second, then returned to a soft amber hue. Trays rattled, cutlery shifted, but no one complained. In seat 2A, the man checked his belt quietly, then returned to looking out the window. Not much could be seen, just the endless layers of cloud, tinged orange by the setting sun. But there was something in the way he stared, something far beyond the clouds, as if he was reviewing a memory or writing a story in his head. Behind him, Clara disappeared behind the galley curtain. She didn't speak, but her footsteps were quicker, sharper. Inside her chest, a different kind of turbulence had begun to rise. One not caused by weather, but by ego, bruised pride, and a sinking sense that whatever control she thought she had was slipping. In 2A, the man blinked slowly, then closed his eyes for a brief moment. Let the sky shake. He'd weathered worse. He had flown hundreds of times before. Presidential visits, military operations, emergency evacuations, meetings with world leaders in cities that never looked quite like home. But this flight, Flight 227, was different. It was not official, not strategic, not necessary. It was personal. He chose to fly alone. No aides, no bodyguards, no protocol. He wanted to feel what his people felt. The cues, the stares, the fatigue, the quiet insults that didn't come with bullets, but burned all the same. Because some truths could only be learned in silence. He sat in seat 2A, a number chosen not for superstition, but for memory. 2A had been his father's seat on the last plane they ever took together. A humanitarian mission before war stole everything. A time when he was still a soldier, with nothing but hope in his heart and dirt under his nails. Now he carried a country on his shoulders. And yet, in this cabin, he was invisible again. Or worse, visible only as what others assumed he was not. Around him, the cabin moved in slow elegance. Passengers sipped wine, clicked through emails, or dozed under cashmere blankets. But their eyes, now more frequent, more curious, continued drifting toward 2A. They saw something they couldn't quite define. A man with presence but without noise. He didn't scroll on a phone. He wrote with a pen. He didn't wear a Rolex. He wore time in his posture. He didn't demand anything. Yet somehow, he commanded attention. Some passengers tried to rationalize it. Maybe he's a professor, one whispered. Or a diplomat, another offered. No, he's too quiet. He's watching, someone said. And he was. Every glance, every shift, every word not spoken by Clara, he noted, not out of bitterness, but out of habit born from survival. When the food cart arrived, Clara approached row 2 with her usual grace, except for one seat. To 2B, she leaned in with a gentle smile. We have seared salmon or braised lamb tonight, ma'am, both with fresh herbs. I'll take the salmon, the older woman replied, smiling politely. Clara nodded, then turned to 2A, her eyes narrowing as if bracing for something unpleasant. Here's yours, she said curtly, dropping a tray in front of him without naming the dish, skipping the courtesy, and walking away before he could respond. The tray landed with a clatter. Not loud, but intentional. The man glanced down. Lamb. Slightly overcooked. A folded napkin missing. He didn't complain. He simply adjusted the tray, unfolded his own cloth from the side pocket of his seat, and began eating. Quietly, methodically. Like a man who had grown used to turning insult into discipline. Across the aisle, François Delicourt had seen enough. The French CEO, long accustomed to diplomacy and discretion, finally leaned sideways, breaking the sacred first-class bubble. Excuse me, he said to Clara, his tone polite but unmistakably firm. Why are you treating that man with such disrespect? Clara blinked, caught off guard. Sir, she said sharply, her voice tense, please mind your business. François didn't blink. I am minding my business, he replied evenly. I paid for peace, not to witness a paying passenger be insulted. Several passengers turned at the sound of his voice. A few phones once again began recording. Silence tightened. Clara's lips parted as if to retort, but no words came. In seat 2A, the man paused. He looked up, not in surprise, not in gratitude, but with a quiet acknowledgement, a single nod, barely perceptible, yet enough to be understood by anyone who knew the language of dignity. Francois leaned back, folding his arms. And in that moment, the cabin didn't feel so silent anymore. The weight of everything left unsaid was starting to speak. There are moments on a flight when time seems to stretch, when turbulence doesn't come from the clouds but from the people inside the cabin. And in that moment, as Francois Delacour's words hung heavy in the air, something broke. Clara's face flushed, not from embarrassment, but from fury. For hours she had kept her disdain veiled behind manners and protocols. Thin smiles, cold glances, silent omissions. But now she felt it. The loss of control, the scrutiny of her peers, the walls closing in. And so she did what people often do when pride meets exposure. She lashed out. She turned to the man in 2A, her voice sharper than ever, unfiltered and ugly. "You stink up this cabin." The words fell like a blade, swift, cruel, public. A gasp rippled through the cabin. The woman in 3C dropped her spoon. A man 2 rows back sat upright, as if waking from a dream. Even the hum of the engine seemed to dim for a second. But the man in 2A, he didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He didn't even blink. He sat, as he had since boarding, still, grounded, composed. He didn't retaliate, because he didn't need to. The insult had never reached him. It had bounced off the shield of his unshakable calm, and that, more than anything, seemed to enrage Clara further. "You don't belong here," she continued, her voice now brittle with desperation. "Look at you. Just look at you. You think sitting in first class makes you one of us?" Across the aisle, the older French woman in 2B, the one with pearl earrings and a soft, kind presence, shifted in her seat. Her eyes, which had watched everything with silent disapproval, now flashed with clarity. She placed her teacup down gently and turned her full attention to Clara. "That's enough," she said firmly, her accent thick but her tone unwavering. Clara snapped her head toward the woman. "Stay out of this." But the woman didn't back down. "Number, you're out of control. You've been cruel since the moment he boarded." Clara scoffed, incredulous. "You think he belongs here? Really, look at him." The woman didn't answer immediately. She turned toward the man in 2A, who offered her the faintest, warmest nod. She looked back at Clara. "I see a man with more grace than you've shown all flight." At that moment, Francois stood up, slowly, deliberately. "Clara," he said, voice even, yet cutting, "you've embarrassed yourself. You've embarrassed this airline. And you've embarrassed all of us who sat here and watched too long." Clara's mouth opened, but the words stumbled. I was doing my job. We have standards here." Francois shook his head. "Number, you have prejudice. That's what you have." Around them, passengers were no longer just watching. They were part of the moment. Phones were up, eyes were wide. A few nodded slowly, affirming the words that finally put voice to the discomfort they'd all felt simmering for hours. Near the galley, the young male attendant stepped forward. He didn't speak, but his presence said enough. He stood beside the man in 2A, not physically but morally, and all the while the man in 2A remained in his seat, silent, serene, not broken, not vindictive, just enduring. His silence was not absence. It was a mirror, and everyone was now forced to look into it. Clara took a step back. Her hands trembled. Her mouth set into a thin, defeated line. The plane kept flying. But in that cabin, something had shifted permanently. And the storm that Clara tried to start? It had turned, not into chaos, but into clarity. The captain's voice returned over the speaker, smooth and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent into Ouagadougou. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened, tray tables are stowed, and seats are in the upright position. Cabin crew, prepare for landing." Around the first-class cabin, seat backs clicked into place. Trays slid into armrests. Blankets were folded, eyes rubbed, headphones removed. The tension that had simmered for most of the flight hadn't vanished. It had simply shifted. Passengers sat straighter now, more alert, casting glances not just at the windows, but towards seat 2A. The man still sat as he had for hours, quietly, calmly, a mountain amid a shifting sky. Then, it began. It started with whispers in the back rows, barely audible over the hum of the engines. "Did you see the ground crew? There's a motorcade waiting." "Military. I think I saw soldiers." Heads turned toward the tiny oval windows. A few gasps escaped lips as passengers leaned to catch a glimpse of what waited on the tarmac below. What they saw made no sense. A black SUV, flanked by uniformed guards. A small red carpet. A man in a suit speaking into an earpiece. Soldiers at attention. In first class, curiosity turned to quiet alarm. "Is there a diplomat on board? A royal? Some kind of state official?" Clara heard it too. She emerged from the galley, face still pale from the confrontation earlier, adjusting her blazer with jittery fingers. She glanced toward the aisle, then toward 2A, and frowned. Her eyes searched the cabin for someone who looked important. Someone with a briefcase, a title, a presence. But all she saw was the same man in black, serene, steady, anonymous. She shook her head, half scoffing to herself. "There was no VIP listed," she muttered. Just then, the young male attendant, the one who had quietly watched it all unfold, approached her. He held his phone in both hands, his expression unreadable. "Clara," he said softly, his voice tight, "you need to see this." She blinked, annoyed, suspicious. "What is it now?" He handed her the phone. The screen lit up with a paused image, a photograph pulled from an online article. The man in 2A, but not in a caftan, in military dress, standing tall on a podium. Behind him, a sea of people waved flags. Soldiers saluted. The headline beneath read, "President Ibrahim Traoré, Commander-in-Chief, Burkina Faso." Clara's breath caught. Her fingers tightened around the phone. She looked again, back at the photo, then towards seat 2A. The same man, same eyes, same stillness. But now everything was different. No, that can't be," she whispered. She turned to the window, the motorcade, the red carpet, the soldiers. It all clicked into place, not as a coincidence, but as confirmation. Her knees felt weak, her mouth dry. She looked at the young attendant, hoping he would say it was a joke, a mistake. But he only gave a small nod and said simply, "You had no idea, did you?" Clara didn't answer. She couldn't. The silence she had tried to weaponize against him had now turned on her. And down in seat 2A, the man gently closed his notebook, placed the pen inside, and reached for his bag. He stood. The plane was still gliding toward the runway, but the moment had already landed. And the truth, the one that had waited patiently, without needing to raise its voice, had finally taken flight. The tires kissed the runway with a gentle bounce. A few passengers clapped lightly. A polite gesture more out of habit than emotion. But in first class, no one was celebrating. The engines hummed as the plane rolled toward its final position. Seatbelts clicked open. Phones buzzed back to life. Bags were unzipped. But the quiet tension in row 2 hadn't faded. If anything, it had thickened, settling into the space like fog. And then came the first true break in silence. A whisper, followed by a gasp. Then the unmistakable shuffle of passengers leaning toward their windows. "Is that a red carpet? There are soldiers out there. Who are they waiting for?" Through the tiny oval windows, the truth began to unfold in crimson and steel. On the tarmac, beneath the afternoon sun, stood 5 uniformed soldiers in ceremonial dress, perfectly still, their posture unshakable. A black SUV with diplomatic plates waited just beyond the staircase. A red carpet stretched from the bottom step to the vehicle door. Clean, straight, deliberate. The jet bridge wasn't being used. This was no ordinary pickup. Inside the cabin, passengers froze. Conversation stopped. Eyes widened. All attention, all assumptions, all judgment began to circle back to one point. Seat 2A. The man stood now, calm and unrushed. He reached for his duffel bag from the overhead bin with the same quiet grace he had carried the entire flight. No fanfare, no sudden shift in posture. He simply stepped into his moment, as if it were always his. And in truth, it was. Clara stood by the galley, gripping the headrest of a nearby seat for support. Her face, once smug and certain, had turned ghostly pale. Beads of sweat formed along her hairline. Her lips parted, but no sound came. She took one step forward, then another. "Sir, wait," she called, her voice cracking. I didn't know. I didn't mean to." He paused. That was all it took. He didn't turn fully. Just half. Just enough for his profile to catch the cabin light. The passengers watched, holding their breath. "Would it have made a difference," he asked softly, "if you had known?" Clara's mouth moved, but no words followed, because there was no answer that would have mattered. The man turned fully now, facing her. Not with fury, but with something far more piercing. Clarity. His voice was low, but it cut through the entire cabin. Respect is not a gift for the powerful. It is a duty to every human being. He held her gaze for a moment longer. Not to humiliate, not to win, but to leave her and everyone else with the truth she had tried so hard to ignore. Then he turned back toward the door and walked down the aisle. The flight attendants stepped aside without a word. Even Francois, the CEO, stood as he passed, offering a respectful nod. The older woman in 2B placed a hand over her heart. Cameras recorded from trembling hands. Some passengers looked away in shame. Others stared, stunned, as the quiet man exited the aircraft and descended the steps. Outside, the soldiers snapped to a perfect salute. He returned it with a simple nod, then paused at the foot of the staircase. The SUV door stood open, waiting. The wind caught the edge of his long black caftan, fluttering it just enough to reveal the national emblem embroidered beneath the fold. But he didn't enter the car. Instead, he turned back and looked up at the plane. Inside, Clara stood frozen. His eyes met hers one last time, not with bitterness, but with something heavier. Disappointment. She had never once asked for his name. Now the whole world would never forget it. And then, without another word, Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, stepped into the waiting vehicle and closed the door behind him. The red carpet lay empty behind him, but the message he left, that would stay with them forever. The door of the black SUV closed with a soft thud. The sun shone bright across the tarmac, painting gold along the roof of the plane, warming the red carpet that now lay behind a man who needed no ceremony to command a nation. Inside the aircraft, no one moved. For a long moment, the cabin of Flight 227 felt like a sealed time capsule, heavy with silence, echoing with everything that had just happened. Seatbelts undone, bags half lifted, conversations frozen mid-breath. But no one said a word. Clara had returned to her jump seat by the galley. Her hands were clenched on her lap. Her gaze was blank, locked somewhere in the direction of seat 2A, now empty but still radiating presence. Her crisp uniform felt like armor she no longer had the strength to wear. Beside her, the young male attendant stared at the floor, his throat tight. He had tried to warn her. He had seen it before anyone else. And still, he had done too little, too late. Francois Delacour sat motionless in his seat, fingers steepled against his lips. The CEO, who had mastered boardroom battles, now found himself unarmed. He had defended the man, yes, but he had waited too long, and that shame settled in his chest like cold iron. Across the cabin, the woman in 2B reached for the cross around her neck. Her hands trembled as she whispered something. Perhaps a prayer, perhaps regret. She had spoken up, but like the rest, she had first chosen silence. No one could pretend anymore. The man they had overlooked, the man some had recorded with half-hidden phones, others had judged in passing glances, was gone. And he had left behind not wrath, not fury, but a mirror held up to every face, and not one reflection came away clean. From the back of first class, a young man slowly raised his phone again. His fingers hovered, then pressed record. He aimed it toward the window where the black SUV, now surrounded by security, slowly pulled away. His voice, quiet but firm, broke the silence. This man flew with us, as one of us. He panned the camera back into the cabin, showing the stunned expressions, the bowed heads, the stillness that had replaced entitlement. Nobody clapped when he got up. Nobody said his name. We judged him, and we were wrong. The video would later go viral, not because of fancy editing or music, but because it captured truth in raw form, a truth that had sat in 2A for 7 hours and never raised its voice once. Another passenger, a young woman seated near 3A, quietly wiped tears from her eyes. Not dramatic sobbing, just silent, constant weeping. She had laughed earlier when Clara made the first comment about the wrong cabin. Now that laughter curdled inside her, she reached into her bag and pulled out a notepad and began to write. Elsewhere, an older man in a tailored suit took off his designer glasses, cleaned them carefully, and stared blankly at the seatback screen in front of him, though it wasn't on. He whispered to himself in French, Nous étions tous aveugles. We were all blind. The intercom chimed once. Cabin crew, doors may now be opened. Ground personnel ready for arrival. But the flight had already landed long ago. Not on the runway, but in the hearts of everyone on board. The lesson wasn't printed in any airline manual. It wasn't taught in training. It wasn't spoken through a public address system. It had walked among them, silent, steady, wrapped not in rank but in restraint. And now, long after the president had left the aircraft, his presence remained, not on the carpet, but in every eye that refused to look away, and in every conscience that could no longer forget. It took less than 2 hours. 2 hours after the wheels of Flight 227 touched down in Ouagadougou, the videos began to flood the internet. Shaky footage recorded on smartphones. Short clips, some just seconds long, captured the confrontation, the silence, the final sentence delivered at the airplane door. Respect is not a gift for the powerful. It is a duty to every human being. By hour 3, the video had surpassed 1 million views. By sunset, it had ignited a firestorm. Headlines exploded. First class racism meets presidential dignity. Woman insults African leader mid-flight, unaware of who he is. He stayed silent. The world heard everything. Clara's name trended within hours. Not as a hero, not as a whistleblower, but as the face of unchecked prejudice. Internet sleuths uncovered her past complaints from passengers. Screenshots emerged of older reviews. Cold, dismissive, selective. This wasn't her first time, just the first time the world was watching. The airline released a formal statement that evening. We are aware of the deeply disturbing incident on Flight 227. The staff member involved has been suspended pending investigation. We condemn all forms of discrimination and are reviewing our internal policies immediately. But the damage was done. In comment sections across platforms, fury and shame mingled with disbelief. How do you treat someone like that? Even if they're not a president? That man held more grace in silence than most leaders do in speeches. The world doesn't need louder voices. It needs deeper hearts. And then came the press conference. Late afternoon outside the presidential palace in Ouagadougou. The air was still. Reporters crowded close, microphones pointed toward a single podium draped with the national flag. When President Ibrahim Traoré stepped out, he was not dressed in military attire. No medals, no signs of rank. Just a plain black jacket, the same one he had worn on the flight. He stood quietly for a moment, scanning the crowd. Then he began, This morning, I boarded a flight not as a head of state, but as a man among others. No security, no escort, just a seat. He paused. What I received was not just poor service, it was hate dressed as protocol, judgment disguised as procedure. But what hurts more is not that it happened to me. It is that it happens to many who have no camera to catch it. There was silence. Then he lifted his gaze, voice steady. I forgive her. A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Yes, he repeated, I forgive her, but this is not the end. It is only a beginning. Let this not be about one person's shame, but about all our responsibility. And with that, he unveiled something more powerful than any punishment. Today, we launched the Dignity Project. He outlined a bold national campaign, mandatory respect and bias training for all public-facing roles, education on equality and history in schools, public service workers evaluated not only by efficiency, but by empathy. Dignity is not a luxury, he said. It is a human right. The crowd erupted in applause, not just for what had been said, but for the way it had been said. Calm, firm, transformative. The world had seen injustice, but now it would witness change, not through vengeance, but through vision. The day after the video went viral, Clara couldn't leave her apartment. She had tried once, stepping outside just after dawn in sunglasses and a hoodie, hoping the city hadn't fully awakened. But it had. The moment she passed the corner bakery, someone gasped and pointed. Two teenagers shouted something. She couldn't quite make out the words. But the laughter that followed stung worse than any insult. She turned back immediately. Back inside her apartment, she locked the door, pulled the curtains, and turned off the lights, even though it was barely 8 a.m. Her phone buzzed constantly. At first, it was messages from her supervisor. Report to HR at 10 a.m. You are officially suspended. Expect internal review. Then came the media requests. We're doing a feature on racial bias in the skies. Would you like to share your side of the story? This is your chance to clear your name. She ignored them all. But the worst weren't the reporters. They were the messages from friends. People she thought she knew. What were you thinking? This is disgusting. I can't believe it. We're done. One simply read, unfriend. And then near midnight, one final message arrived. From her mother, just 2 lines. I raised you better than this. I don't even recognize who you are. Clara dropped the phone onto the floor. It buzzed once more, then went still. She lay on the couch for what felt like hours, staring up at the ceiling. Her apartment, usually so crisp and composed, now felt like a tomb, cold, silent, condemning. She got up, crossed to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water but didn't drink it. Instead, she walked back to the living room, sat down, and opened her laptop. She typed his name into the search bar. Ibrahim Traoré. A sea of articles flooded the screen. Images, speeches, news clips, flags, soldiers, smiles of children, hope in villages, his approval ratings, his controversial reforms, his defiant stance against foreign exploitation, his quiet charisma. And then, the video, her video. Clara clicked it. The screen flickered. There she was, in uniform, confident, polished, cruel, her voice sharp, her eyes dismissive, her posture rigid with self-righteousness. And there he was, silent, still, offering his ticket like a man offering peace to someone armed for war. She watched herself say the words. Are you lost? This is first class. She flinched. Then came the airport footage. Soldiers saluting. The red carpet. The motorcade. The reveal. The gasp in her throat was involuntary. But it wasn't that part that shattered her. It was his eyes. The camera had caught them. Dark, deep, unblinking. When he turned to her and said, would it have made a difference if you had known? There was no venom, no mockery, just quiet disappointment, like a teacher who expected more. She replayed that moment again, and again, and again. Each time it hit harder. He hadn't humiliated her. He hadn't shouted, cursed, or condemned. He had simply walked away, and in doing so, exposed everything. Clara buried her face in her hands. This wasn't just a scandal. It wasn't just about going viral. It was about who she had become. She thought of the passengers, the French CEO who stood up, the woman who said enough, the young male attendant who warned her. They had seen it sooner, and now, so had she. But it was too late. The damage was done. The world had judged, and maybe, just maybe, the judgment was deserved. The volunteer coordinator didn't ask many questions. When Clara showed up at the Refugee Support Center 2 weeks later, with a loose hoodie, no makeup, and a voice barely above a whisper, the woman simply handed her a clipboard and said, We need help folding laundry. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't filmed. There were no redemption arcs in sight, just piles of blankets, crates of canned goods, the faint scent of overcooked rice and soap, and people, lots of people, from countries Clara had once only known as names in news reports: Mali, Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan. She kept her head down. She didn't talk much, but she listened. At first, the stories came in fragments. A woman who'd walked through 2 countries, barefoot with her baby on her back. A teenage boy who lost both parents and still smiled as he handed out bread. An old man who said he used to teach philosophy, but now cleaned toilets for shelter. Clara folded, sorted, wiped counters, each act small, each moment uncomfortable. But each story chipped at something hardened in her. One afternoon, as she was stacking cartons of milk in the back storage, she overheard a little girl crying softly near the coat racks. Clara hesitated, then slowly approached. The girl looked about 7, her dark curls tied in uneven bunches, her teddy bear missing an eye. Clara crouched beside her. "What's wrong?" she asked gently. The girl didn't answer. She only hugged her bear tighter. "Do you want water?" Clara offered. The girl shook her head. Then, barely above a whisper, "They call me dirty at school." Clara's heart clenched. It wasn't the first time she'd heard those words. She had said something like them, once, to a man who didn't deserve it. Now they echoed back at her, through the mouth of a child. She took a deep breath. "They're wrong," she said quietly. "You're not dirty. You're strong and beautiful." The girl didn't reply, but she stopped crying. Just a little. Later that night, Clara sat alone on the steps outside the shelter. Her hands were sore from folding sheets, her shirt stained with soup. But inside her chest, something had shifted. These weren't just refugees. They were people. People with laughter and pain and hope. People who had every reason to judge the world, but chose kindness instead. She thought of the plane again, of how she had looked at the man in 2A, not with curiosity, but with quiet contempt. Not because of anything he had done, but because of how he looked. She had believed she was upholding standards. In truth, she had been enforcing bias. That was the moment Clara understood the real difference between respect and permission. Respect is not something you grant when someone earns it. It's not a prize for appearance or status. It is a starting point, a baseline, a responsibility. Judgment is easy. Compassion takes work. And Clara, for the first time, was finally doing the work. The next morning, before the shelter opened, she took out a pen and a blank piece of paper. At the top, she wrote, "Dear President Ibrahim Traoré." She didn't know if he would read it. She didn't know if it would change anything. But she knew it had to be written, not to ask for forgiveness, but to prove to herself that she was no longer blind. It had been a cold morning at the shelter. The heating had broken again, and volunteers wore jackets inside as they moved crates of clothes and served steaming bowls of porridge. Clara had been assigned to the children's corner, a small section of worn rugs, some storybooks and torn covers, and a few toys that had clearly survived many small battles. That's when she saw her again, the little girl with the teddy bear. She was sitting in the farthest corner, knees tucked into her chest, arms wrapped tightly around her toy. The same one missing one eye, with stuffing peeking from a torn seam. Her shoes were mismatched, her sweater too thin. Her eyes, wide and tired, stared at the floor. Clara crouched slowly, careful not to startle her. "Hi again," she whispered. "Remember me?" The girl looked up, just barely. Clara smiled gently and sat down beside her without waiting for permission. "That's a brave bear you have," she said, pointing to the stuffed toy. The girl didn't answer, but her fingers clutched the bear tighter. A pause. Then in a voice so quiet, Clara almost missed it. "The girls at school said I'm dirty." Clara's throat tightened. She had prepared tea, folded blankets, washed dishes, but nothing had readied her for this sentence. "They said I smell, that I'm poor, that my skin's the color of dirt." And then, the words Clara once threw at a man in seat 2A without flinching came back like a ghost dragging chains. Clara didn't respond right away. Her chest ached, her fingers trembled. Then she did something she had never done before, not in uniform, not during the scandal, not even in front of her own mother. She cried. Silent tears at first, then deeper ones. Not loud, not performative, but real. Raw. The girl looked confused at first, then surprised. And then she leaned into Clara's side. Clara wrapped her arms around her, gently, as if holding both the child and every broken part of herself. They stayed like that for a long time. When the girl was called for lunch, she stood, gave Clara one last glance and whispered, "You're nice." Clara smiled, but it came with more tears. That night, back in her small apartment, Clara sat at her desk. No lights, just a desk lamp and a blank sheet of paper. She began to write, not to apologize publicly, not to save her job, but because something inside her refused to remain silent any longer. Dear President Ibrahim Traoré, I don't expect you to read this. I don't even know if you'll remember my face, but I remember yours. I remember your silence. I remember your eyes. You didn't shout. You didn't accuse. You didn't humiliate me, but you held a mirror to my soul. I was blind with pride, poisoned by assumptions. Your silence woke me louder than any speech ever could. I'm changing, not because I was caught, but because I was wrong. Today a child looked at me and didn't see the person I used to be. I want to become worthy of that gaze. Thank you for your strength, for your restraint, for your dignity. I will never forget it. Clara. She placed the letter in an envelope. No cameras, no announcement. Just her name, just her truth, just hope. Folded gently, like the bear in that child's arms. The sun streamed through the tall windows of the presidential office in Ouagadougou, casting long golden rays across the polished desk. It was still early morning. The city outside buzzed gently with the sounds of a new day. Markets opening, birds chirping, car horns echoing in the distance. President Ibrahim Traoré sat alone at his desk, a soft leather folder open before him. He wasn't reading state reports nor security briefs. He was holding a small hand-addressed envelope. No official seal, no printed header. Just one word written neatly across the front in blue ink, Clara. Inside was the letter. He had read it the night before. And again this morning, not quickly, not critically, but slowly, as one reads something written not for applause, but for truth. Her words had not begged for forgiveness. They had not asked for pity. They carried no excuses. They simply admitted fault. And in that humility, they spoke louder than the insults once hurled across the first-class aisle. President Traoré gently folded the letter along its crease. The paper had been handled with care. A corner slightly smudged, likely from tears. A name signed at the bottom, not in arrogance, but in regret. He placed the letter inside a narrow drawer on the right side of his desk, a drawer already filled with many others. Letters from strangers, from children, from airline workers, from passengers who had sat nearby. Some had cried, some had apologized, some had simply said thank you. The drawer was almost full now, a quiet archive of human awakening. He closed it softly. Moments later, his assistant knocked and entered, a file in hand. "Mr. President," the young man said, "you asked to be kept updated on the mail response. We've now received over 2,000 messages from 19 countries, schools, universities, churches, even airline staff unions." He placed the file gently on the desk. "Some want to meet you, some want to start programs in your name, and, well, sir, some just want to say they were wrong." President Traoré nodded slowly. Then he looked out the window for a long time and past the palace walls, toward the city. His voice, when he finally spoke, was soft, but steady. "Forgiveness," he said, "is the beginning, not the end." The assistant looked puzzled. "Sir?" "When we forgive," Traoré continued, turning back to the young man, "we don't erase the wound. We acknowledge it. And then we choose what grows around it." He tapped the drawer gently with his fingers. "She chose to write. That's enough. I don't need her to kneel, or explain, or suffer." The pause. "I do need others to learn from it, not for her sake, for all of ours." The assistant nodded, quietly moved. We're drafting the first phase of the Dignity Project, sir. Curriculum proposals, media outreach, airline training modules. The story is already being used in high schools across Burkina Faso and even in parts of Europe. Traoré's lips curved into a faint smile. Good, he said. Let the lesson outlive the moment. He stood walking toward a small bookshelf near the window. There, among biographies and law books, sat a wooden box, carved with the national emblem. He opened it, took out a worn cloth emblem, the same he had once carried in his coat pocket on that unforgettable flight. He held it for a moment, then placed it on the desk, beside the letter folder. We wear titles, he said, mostly to himself, but we carry dignity inside us. No one can see it unless we show them how. The assistant quietly stepped back toward the door. Should I respond to her letter, sir? He asked. Traoré looked up, then back down at the drawer. No, he said gently. Some letters don't need replies, they just need to be heard. And with that he returned to work, not as a man wounded by prejudice, but as a leader building bridges from silence. The hall was silent, not the kind of silence born from boredom or formality, but the kind that settled deep into the chest, commanding attention without force. Rows of dignitaries, teachers, students, airline executives, civil servants, and journalists sat in respectful stillness, waiting. President Ibrahim Traoré stepped up to the podium without music, without applause. He wore no military uniform, no decorated sash, just a simple dark suit and a small pin, bearing the flag of Burkina Faso. Behind him, the national seal. On the large screen beside him, just 4 words, "The Dignity Project begins." He paused for a moment before speaking. Weeks ago, he began, I boarded a flight not as a president, but as a man alone. Quiet, unknown. He looked across the hall, meeting eyes with students in the front rows, then with a woman in a school uniform near the aisle who clutched a notepad tightly. I did not ask for special treatment. I did not reveal my name. And I received what too many of us receive in silence. Another pause. Disrespect, prejudice, smallness disguised as professionalism. He let the words sit. But this story was never about me. It was about all of us. A soft murmur passed through the audience, the kind that signals agreement without words. It was about what we allow, about what we excuse, about what we teach, or fail to. He shifted his tone slightly, warmer now. When a man is judged by the color of his skin before the contents of his mind, when a child is told she is dirty before she can even spell the word dignity, when silence is mistaken for weakness, he let that last line breathe. Then we have failed, not as individuals, but as a society. He gestured toward the screen. New words appeared. Respect is the starting line, not the reward. A few in the audience nodded. Some wrote furiously, Today I am proud to announce the launch of the Dignity Project, a national initiative that will start here, in Burkina Faso, and extend to wherever human hearts beat. Applause not loud, but sincere. Every school will now include respect and empathy as core parts of its character education, not in theory but in real, living conversations. Images flashed briefly. Children in classrooms, students creating artwork about equality, teachers leading open forums. In our airlines, we are rolling out mandatory training called Respect First, not as punishment, but as recalibration. Camera cuts showed CEOs of 3 regional airlines seated near the front. One of them clapped. In workplaces from airports to ministries, we are integrating dignity-based training for all levels. Because change does not begin at the top, it begins within. He looked down for a moment, then up again, more softly now. One woman, once blinded by pride, chose to see again. One child, once hurt by words, chose to trust again. And I, once judged, chose not revenge, but restoration. Silence again, but not empty. Full. We cannot erase ignorance overnight, but we can outgrow it. A final image appeared, a child holding a sign that read, If your power makes others feel small, it is not power. It is weakness. Traoré stepped back from the podium. He didn't wave. He didn't wait for applause. He simply nodded and walked off the stage. The room remained still for a moment longer. Then came the sound, rising slowly but with force, not just clapping, but standing, applauding not the man, but the message. The uniform stayed in the closet, neatly pressed, hung by color, shoes aligned below them. But Clara hadn't touched them in months, and she had no plans to. The airline had offered her a chance to return. Quietly. No public statement, no press. Just a new route assignment and a stern warning to stay professional. She declined, not out of shame, but because that chapter had closed. She now spent her mornings in a small community center on the outskirts of Paris, a modest building that smelled of soup and hand sanitizer. It was far from the polished cabins of first class, but here she found something she'd never felt at 30,000 feet. Peace. Clara helped wherever she was needed, sorting donated clothes, teaching French to newly arrived families, listening. She listened a lot now, to broken stories and broken accents, to mothers speaking of fear, to children who missed the sound of home. She didn't interrupt, she didn't correct, she didn't assume. She just listened, as someone once listened to her without saying a word. There were no cameras here, no redemption arc to post online, just days filled with small moments that didn't need witnesses to matter. One evening, after helping a teenager fill out a job application, Clara returned home, made herself tea, and sat down at the same old wooden desk. She lit a candle, the same way she had the first time. Then she pulled out a fresh sheet of paper. This letter was different. There were no tear stains. Her handwriting was steadier. There was no panic in her pen, only clarity. Dear Mr. President, I don't expect another reply, and I'm not writing to fix anything. I just wanted to tell you, I haven't returned to the skies, not because I was chased out, but because I finally chose to land. I still work with people. I still make them feel seen. But this time, not for tips, not for good reviews, but because they are human. Not because I was caught, but because I was wrong. I still think about that flight, about your silence. It haunted me. Then it healed me. You never raised your voice, and that made mine impossible to ignore. You never pointed at me, and yet I've never felt more clearly seen. I thank you, not for what you said, but for what you didn't. That has made all the difference. Clara. She folded the letter and sealed it carefully. No one else would read it. She wasn't even sure if she would send it. But it needed to be written. Sometimes growth doesn't announce itself. It just continues. She looked at the small African tapestry that now hung on her wall, a gift from a refugee child. It read, "Kindness needs no uniform." Clara smiled. She wasn't the same woman who once guarded first class like a fortress. Now she guarded something else entirely, a quieter dignity, a softer strength, and the simple decision to be better than yesterday. The auditorium at the University of Ghana was packed. Students sat shoulder to shoulder, notebooks ready, phones recording. At the podium stood President Ibrahim Traoré. No guards, no fanfare, just a man in simple clothes and a thoughtful gaze. He didn't start with politics. Millions are judged every day, he said, not for what they've done, but for how they look. He paused. The room was silent. I took a flight. I sat quietly. I was insulted, dismissed, not because I caused trouble, but because I looked like I didn't belong. Heads nodded. Some students wiped their eyes. I didn't tell this story to gain sympathy. I share it for one reason, so you will listen, not to respond, not to debate, but to understand. He spoke not of power, but of humanity, not of vengeance, but of dignity. True leadership begins with empathy. Real strength comes from restraint. And with that, he stepped back. The applause shook the hall. As he walked off the stage, a quote appeared on the screen behind him, bold and clear. If your power makes others feel small, it is not power. It is weakness. The room erupted. Some students stood. Others wept. Professors nodded solemnly. That quote became more than a sentence. Within weeks, it was painted across school walls, printed on t-shirts, posted on airport walls, even shared by airline CEOs. It became a quiet revolution, one line of truth that fit in a tweet, but struck like thunder. Children memorized it. Teachers used it in classrooms. Some even etched it onto bracelets and notebooks. The story of the man in seat 2A was no longer a moment. It was a mirror, a movement, a message for generations. Months later, on a different day, another flight prepared to board. The airport was just as noisy, just as diverse, but this time something had changed. In the first-class cabin, seat 2A was empty. A new flight attendant, a young black woman, stood near the entrance. Her uniform was crisp. Her eyes were kind. As passengers boarded, she offered a polite smile, bowing her head ever so slightly. Not because of status, but out of respect. She glanced at 2A, then adjusted the pillow on the seat, carefully, gently, as if it were more than just a chair. And as the cabin doors closed, a quiet narrator's voice echoed in our minds. Never underestimate the silence of the one sitting next to you, for they may be carrying not a title, but a lesson. This story touched me deeply, not because of its twist, but because of its truth. I've seen how quickly people are judged for how they look, speak, or dress. What stood out wasn't the power revealed at the end, but the power of restraint, of choosing dignity over outrage. That's rare, and it's powerful. Clara's transformation reminded me that even those who've caused pain can grow, if they're willing to listen, reflect, and act. It gave me hope that empathy can still cut through prejudice. We all sit next to someone on life's journey, on the bus, at work, in the coffee shop. We never know their story until we choose to care. So I ask you, when was the last time you paused your assumptions to make room for someone else's truth? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.